Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. I just wanted to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for joining my Introduction to Painting class. Where we'll be focusing on glazing and grisaille methods. My name is Andrea. I've been pursuing my career as a professional artist since 2006. And throughout my journey, I've developed an unwavering passion for capturing the imagination and beauty of the natural world through landscape painting and acrylics. As your instructor, my goal for this class is to provide you with profound understanding of acrylic paints and their unique properties. We're going to be going through a lot of the backbone of how they're made and the different ways that we can use them to gain different effects. So what I want to do is empower you with the knowledge and skills to effectively manage color, saturation, vibrancy, and light in your own paintings. And by the end of our time together, my hope is that you walk away with not only the technical expertise, but also a deep appreciation for the limitless possibilities that acrylic paints offer. Once again, I just wanted to express my sincere appreciation for your presence and commitment to this artistic journey. Let's embark on this creative endeavor together and discover the magic that unfolds when imagination meets brushstroke. So I wanted to start very quickly with just sort of an introduction to what acrylic paints are, a little bit about the history and how they're made. So first, we're going to dive into the history, and essentially, they came about, they're actually a fairly new invention. They came about sort of in the late 1940s. Manufacturers were looking for an answer to interior house paints, actually, for like walls. Traditionally, paints or interiors were painted in an oil-based paint. Now, the problem with those was that they were fairly toxic. They had a really intense odor to them that could linger for months, and they also took a really long time to dry. So the issue was that you would paint the room and you'd have to keep everyone out of there for many, many days even before it was fully dry. And even after that, there was a lingering odor. So initially, the paints were developed for painting interiors, but then they realized that this could be actually very interesting. The properties of acrylics paint could be interesting for fine artists. Acrylic paints have sort of lagged behind oils on the market in terms of gallery sales, but in recent years, their market value has begun to match that of oil paints as their development has been refined and the quality of the paints is a lot better. So they're just as light fast, meaning they won't fade. They're actually very hardy. They have a flexible surface when they dry, so they're less prone to even cracking in some of the things that oil paintings can sort of face over years. So if you go into a commercial gallery now, you don't need to worry about if you're painting an acrylic, is it going to sell for less than an oil painting? If you look at the price tags for similar types of art on a similar size in a gallery between oil and acrylic, the price point is going to be very similar. So acrylic paint is basically a water-based paint. It's basically composed of colored pigments that are dispersed in an acrylic polymer emulsion. It's basically a plastic. So when acrylic dries, it dries as a plastic. And there's sort of three different parts to this. So there's the pigments, which are the colors, and sometimes they are manufactured colors, and sometimes they are natural colors, like an iron ore, for example, is something that's naturally occurring in the environment. The binder is an acrylic polymer emulsion, so it's basically a synthetic resin, and it's basically just an adhesive that holds all the pigments together. When the paint dries, it basically becomes like a solid, flexible film, and it adheres to the surface, and it's water resistant. In fact, it's kind of waterproof. It's actually easier to get a dry oil paint out of a fabric than it is to get an acrylic. So it's quite hardy as a surface. It's also fairly resistant to scratching, you'll notice. So it is a nice solid surface when it's finished. So the vehicle is part of the paint that carries the pigment and the binder. So water is the vehicle for water-based acrylic, whereas oil would be the vehicle for like an oil paint. So maybe you would add a linseed oil or a safflower oil, for example, or even a paint thinner would become a vehicle. And then at the end of that, there's also some fillers. So sometimes paint manufacturers, to reduce the cost of a paint, they may add some fillers or additives So it just kind of enhances the performance and can also kind of bulk up the quantity of the paint. And you'll find this a lot in student grade paints. So after this, there's a lot of different types of paints on the market. You will find heavy body, soft body, and fluid acrylics. Now, they all work in very different ways. Heavy body is generally for doing nice thick painting with texture, whereas soft body and fluid acrylics are more for doing like glazes, washes, and even airbrushing. So it's just to know essentially what kind of paint you want to choose for the type of work that you want to do. I will say that with heavy body acrylics, you can thin them out with a variety of mediums that I will show you so that they can move a little bit more like the soft body or fluid acrylics. You can't easily make a fluid acrylic heavier. There are some things that you could add, but it will sort of also wash out the color. But you can sort of thin down a heavy body fairly easy, so it moves a little bit more like a fluid. The brands that I really love for professional acrylics are the Triart is my absolute favorite, and Golden. Also, Winsor Newton acrylics are quite good on the market. Liquitex is okay. I found some of the pigments to be granulating and they just don't seem to carry the same sort of vibrancy that Triart and Golden carry. So just so you can see the difference sort of between heavy body, soft body, and fluid. And there's also other names to be aware of that you're going to come across. So high viscosity is basically heavy body. So the high viscosity is a thick format. Low viscosity is more water-like and free-flowing. It seems a little counterintuitive, but that's how the names go. So this is sort of what you'll see in terms of how they sit on the canvas. So the high viscosity or heavy body is thicker, and then the low viscosity spreads a lot thinner and is a little bit more even of an application. Oops. So there's some different advantages of heavy body and soft body. So again, heavy body offers high color intensity, retains its brush strokes, and is ideal for impasto or texture or palette knife. Blending can be challenging, which is why sometimes you want to switch to a soft body or fluid for glazing. They dry quickly unless you're going really thickly with them. And you have to dilute it for glazes or washes, which I will show you what to use for that. Soft body, it allows smoother blending and layering, and it's suitable for detail work and glazing as it spreads very easily. It can be applied very thinly in layers, which again is great for glazing. I even sometimes use it to give sort of a watercolor effect on my acrylic works. It doesn't appear maybe as painterly because of the way that it spreads and it's not as thick as the heavy body. And you may need to put a lot more layers, which just makes it so your paintings take a lot more time. And then fluid acrylics are also excellent for glazing and layering. They usually offer a very high pigment load. So I have some really good fluid acrylics here from Golden that I will show you that I've been using. And they're also suited for pouring and fluid art techniques as well as airbrushing. They also dry very quick, so you don't have a lot of reworking opportunities. So essentially, you just want to think about what type of painting you want to be doing for what type of paints you're choosing. You can kind of mix them all. They're interchangeable. They just have different properties, so it's just kind of good to know how they work, and you'll sort of come to understand your own paints and how they work and how to work with them. But those are sort of the basics of the heavy body, soft body, and fluid when you see them in the stores. In terms of how all of this applies to this particular class, because we're dealing with glazing techniques, which is layering. Generally speaking, I want to be using transparent pigments so the colors mix between each other. So what happens with transparent colors is that the light will pass through a layer of paint that is transparent, hit off the canvas, which is usually a white color, and bounce back into our eyes. So it essentially what's happening is it works a little bit like watercolor where it retains the vibrancy of the canvas and it makes it look very luminous when it bounces back. If we were to take the same color and mix it with white, we may end up with a color that is higher in value, However, it will be less saturated because white desaturates. So you will actually end up, even though it might be lighter in value, you will end up with something that looks less luminous and like it has less light in it. So in effect, adding the white to the paint diminishes the look of luminosity. This is also important when it comes to mixing your colors, because as we know, if we mix directly a blue and a yellow with, let's say, opaque or even transparent pigments, we are going to get a green. But we can also do this optically by using transparent colors, where if, for example, we tint the canvas as a yellow, and then we put a layer of blue transparent paint over it, the light is going to pass through the blue layer of paint, bounce off the yellow layer, and when it comes back to our eye, it's going to give us a green color. This will also create something that looks more luminous and light-filled than something that has been mixed together. With opaque colors, it's the same idea. However, the light doesn't actually get through to the bottom layer, so we will not see the color of the canvas as it's been completely coated. Essentially, the light comes and hits off the surface of the blue paint and then just bounces straight back. So you're getting just a very solid view of the color. I also have a bunch of stuff on here for paint labels, and we don't need to go through this today, but this is the high flow transparent color set from Golden that I have. I didn't use this on the transparent, or on the, I didn't use this on the demo painting that I showed. However, I think I'm going to use it for these ones just so you can see the difference. I actually used a heavy body tri-art palette for the demo painting. You'll also see all of this stuff sort of on the labels. So these are the names of the colors and the code. The ASTM is essentially just a standard that will tell you if there's hazardous components, and also the light fast. So a light fast of 1 is excellent. So this color here will not fade over time. And then all the way down to light fast 5, which means it will fade quite quickly. And the series number, as we see, it's essentially relating to price. And the reason why it relates to price is because it depends on the cost that goes into making the paint. So if we have a pigment, for example, like cerulean blue, which is very expensive to produce in general or to mine, also the cobalts, they're usually quite expensive, whereas something that is easily manufactured in a lab, for example, would be less expensive because they're just easier to produce in general. So that's what the series means. So when you're looking at paint prices in the art store, you're going to see series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 relating to the pigments, and then usually there's a pricing chart that will tell you the price for those. So that's what the series means. In terms of paint grade, you'll also see a choice between student versus artist or professional. Generally speaking, as mentioned before, the student quality paints have more filler added in. So for example, this is how it might look in a chart. So an artist grade or professional grade paint is going to have more pigment, so more of that expensive color in it that gives you the vibrancy, and then there'll be a stabilizer and a vehicle. Whereas the student grade might only have a tiny amount of actual color and then some filler that it mixed with. So it looks in the tubes very similar to the artist grade paint, but when you start trying to mix them together, you're going to be losing some vibrancy. And then so that's sort of the basic breakdown of acrylic painting. So I just want to go through a few materials now that I have and that I've used. So I'm going to be using some black and white paint to do our grisaille. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the differences between the blacks. So first of all, we have Mars Black. Mars Black is the warmest of the blacks, and it's also the most opaque. Ivory Black is a cool, transparent black, and Carbon Black is the darkest black, and it's also transparent. I don't remember which one I used actually in the sample image, but I think I'm going to go for a Mars Black with this one to try it out, just because I've noticed that mixing or glazing yellows over can yield some greens. And as I mentioned, when the light goes through the paint onto whatever's on the surface and bounces back, the colors on the surface are going to be influencing the color that we see because of the way the light moves through the paint. So I want to take a warmer black to try to counteract a little bit of that greening that happens. If you actually mix black paint, especially like an ivory black, if you mix this with the yellow, it actually yields a really nice green color. So that's why if you're fighting with some greens as you're glazing, it's probably the black. And you can also counteract that a little bit with the complementary color by adding a bit of sort of red or orange into the yellow just to warm it up a little, and it'll counteract some of that. The other thing that you could do is just warm either your black up or do a grisaille, which is actually a brunei, which would be just the same concept but using browns. So I'm gonna use it with the Mars black, but use whatever blacks you have on hand. Just for the sake of exercise, it's not gonna make that much of a difference. In terms of whites, this is the one that I use. I also sometimes use the Liquitex Basic for my underpainting, and if I'm just going over like a background before I start painting, because it is cheaper. It still has a light fast, of course this one's upside down. It still has a light fast rating of 1. So does this, so I'm pretty confident that this is gonna to stay and not fade with my other colors for backgrounds, but anything on top of my painting, I always use the professional quality. So titanium white is the most basic white on the market. There is another one called mixing white. Mixing white is for glazing. However, as you can see on this, when it thins down, you can see some of the black lines through. So that means that it's sort of, when it is thin, it is sort of semi-opaque, and this will give you a veil. The same thing happens with the mixing or glazing white. It's still sort of semi-transparent. It's not fully transparent. So you will always have that sort of milky quality to it. There's also lead white for oil paints. We don't find those in acrylic. It's toxic, but it's incredible. It's a little bit less cool in color than the titanium. Titanium is very cool, so it will cool your colors when you mix them. Yeah, so this is sort of the standard white that everyone uses. There are other whites that have a warmer, cooler tint that you can get, but you can also warm and cool your white just by adding a little bit of yellow or orange or whatever. So you don't always need to use the cold titanium white straight out of the tube if you need a warmer white. In terms of what I'm using, so I have all of these golden fluid acrylics, and actually I have a few of these too, because they didn't have all the colors I wanted. These ones are transparent in color, as you can see by the little bars here. The ultramarine isn't transparent, it's more of a semi-transparent, but it also works. Payne's gray is one of my favorite colors instead of black. I use this quite often for creating shadows. Sap green is another great color to use for earthy greens if this is too cool, and then I generally just mix between these and add my regular white to them if I need to thicken them up or change their value. In terms of glazing mediums, these out of the way. All right, my favorite one, absolute favorite, is actually this one's looking, is the Slow Dry Fluid Additive by Liquitex. This feels a lot like water. It's funny because the label is very purple and it's coming off gray on my camera. Anyways, yeah, so it is a slow dry, so it gives me more working time. You do have to add a bit of water with it to use it, and it's a dream for blending with. So I like to use this on fur, and if I ever have to paint skin or anything that needs some blending. Another one that I really quite like is the Satin Glazing Liquid Medium. There's also the Airbrush Medium, and there is a Gloss Medium. They all do similar things. They dry clear. They're meant to be sort of added as a vehicle to help move the paint. The Glazing Slow Dry Extender, this one will slow the drying time as well as sort of thin the paint. This one actually I find extends the drying time even more. I love using this one. It is designed for spraying, but I use it with my brush. The gloss medium is a little bit more thick, um, but it also works very nicely. The thing I will say about these versus this one is that these become a lot tackier more quickly. So you'll sort of notice as you're working, they start to dry. And if you go over with your brush again, they could sort of like peel up or lift a little bit, and it changes the texture on the surface. So you really have to be careful with working with these when working with these to make sure they're not getting tacky as you're still trying to spread. There's also clear leveling gel. I tend to use this between layers, and especially if I'm finding that my surface is a little bit too absorbent. If I want to just put sort of a plastic film, this dries clear and completely flat. I'll also use it to just sort of give a layer between my coats of paint for glazing, because it helps create space where the light can go through, and it can actually help to increase how luminous the painting looks just by having this between your coats of clear or transparent pigment. And then for surfaces, so when it comes to anything studying, I don't want to use obviously expensive canvases. You can buy cheap canvases from the dollar store, but also I tend to use watercolor paper, and this is just the Dessert brand. It's quite cheap. I have a whole book, and as you can see, this is all acrylic paint, and it goes over it quite nicely, and then I can make some notes. So we will be using these, or I'll be using this to do my demos. You can kind of see how well this goes down. If you're finding it too absorbent, you can actually just put a coat of clear or even white gesso, or even the leveling gel, just to give a more of a plasticky finish. The other options for you are and I don't remember the name of this because I lost the front of it, but it's basically just a pad of canvas paper. They're also quite cheap. It just gives you more of that sort of canvas look. So that's another option for you. I would say the cheapest is probably a cheap watercolor book because the paper is nice and thick. So another thing I like to use is a Stay Wet palette. So this has a lid, and it creates a airtight seal when it closes. They usually come with a sponge. However, I find they do get moldy. So this is actually just some folded up paper towel that I've dampened. And then it also comes with the palette paper, which also becomes damp, and this is where I put my paint on for mixing. So when I close it for the night and open it in the morning, it will stay dry. But as I mentioned, if you leave the lid on for too long and you forget that you have paint in there, it will stay wet for months, and it can mold, and mold can be dangerous. So this is why I tend to like using the paper towel instead. I also like to keep dry paper towel on hand just in case I make a mess. I need to clean something up, or if I put too much paint down or whatever. Always a jar of water for cleaning my brushes and just helping the paint move if I need to add a little bit of water to my paints. And in terms of brushes, I generally keep a variety on hand. When it comes to acrylic, honestly, the cheap brushes will do. You don't need to get really expensive ones like you might with watercolor or oil paints. So whatever, any old brush will do. And yeah, so we're gonna get started today with just some exercises because I kind of want you to know how these paints work together. So let me see my little book here. As I mentioned, we are going to be playing with glazing. So I'm just going to take a little bit of yellow. As you can see, that's quite fluid. And I will take a little bit of blue. So this is a green blue. This is quite high staining. So this is something else you're gonna have to pay attention to, and you'll sort of get to know it with the paints that you have. Some pigments are very high staining and some pigments are less staining, and the higher staining pigments tend to overpower the lower staining pigments. I think I will also take a red. This is a blue red. I like to keep a warm or blue-ish or sorry, cool is bluish and a warm or orangish red on hand. Same with my blues. I like to keep a green blue and a purple blue on hand. Yellow is yellow. There's transparent and less transparent. Some will have a green cast. This has sort of a green cast. So sometimes I will take a warmer yellow. For example, something like this that has a more orange cast, and you'll sort of get the feel of how your colors work over time. I'm also going to take, let's say, some gloss medium here. So this you'll see is white. And what we're going to do is we're just going to play with color mixing and practice layering. So let's say we take first some yellow and some blue and we mix it. This is sort of the color that we get. And obviously you can change the color of it just by adding more or less yellow or blue. So we're going to get that nice green color. I also want to take, let's say, just for an experiment, we're going to take some yellow and I'm going to mix it in with some of this clear gel medium. So as you can see, the gel medium is thicker and is giving me some paint or like brush strokes. So for that, I might actually just take a thicker brush just to get a more even spread. And as you can see, when it's not straight onto the paper, it's sort of allowing more light to pass through and you're getting a little bit more relief. I will do the same. I'm going to take some of this and just a little bit of blue. So as you can see, that's quite thin. Just going to add it. You can see through the paints. So we're suspending the pigment and basically thinning it even further by using the acrylic gel medium. And then let's say we do one, like for example, if I were just to take the yellow, I just want to show you the difference. It's a bit more intense and it goes straight through the paper. And let's do the blue. Let's do the same thing with the blue, just so you can see it. I'm gonna add a little tiny bit of water just to get it moving. So you can see the difference of adding for a gel medium versus no gel medium. We're just letting this dry. So partly I'm making these swatches now just so we can let them dry. And then let's take, let's say, some of this blue with some gel medium, a little bit more. And I'm gonna add some red over this after. And we'll take some red. I'm cleaning my brush every time with my paper towel, just because I want these to be nice and clean mixes. And we'll add some red over here. So this stuff shouldn't take too long to dry. Oh, and just for fun, I'm actually going to take some of my red and blue and mix these together just so you can see the color that they give. And again, depending on how much red or blue you put into this mix, it's going to change the color of purple that you have, whether it's more of a blue cast or a yellow cast, or a blue cast or a red cast. All right, so these are still a bit tacky, but these ones are nice and dry. So I'm actually just going to grab some more of this blue. Got it a bit dirty there. All right, so if now we take a tiny bit of this blue in some gel medium, so it's quite thin, and I put it over my yellow, we see both blue and yellow, but the resulting color is green. versus when we mixed the blue and green directly together. So we do end up with a very similar color, but the way that we perceive these colors is quite different. We can do the same thing now with the yellow. Take some gel medium and mix some yellow in. And we're going to go over the top. So the resulting color is a green. So because my pigment for the phthalo is so staining and intense, it's going to automatically sort of read through the yellow a little bit more aggressively. So if I go, that's dry. So if I do it over the one now with the gel medium that was in the blue, we see we get a more sort of even green tone because it's been less absorbed into the paper and there's more light already within the pigments. And there's sort of more light bouncing around in the whole mixture. I'm going to do the same for this one. So I'm going to take gel medium and my blue. So again, this has been thinned out by suspending the pigment into a medium as opposed to letting it go straight to paper. So as you can see, the resulting colors are still in the green family. They're just mixing by glazing and not by mixing the pigments directly. We're gonna do some red over this one to give us that purple. So just take a bit of our red, mixing in, and I'm just gonna go over top. Add a little bit more pigment to that. So our resulting color is a purple. And you can see, get a lot of nice variation because we do see some of the brush strokes in there. And we see both red and blue. But the resulting overall effect is of a purple. Do the same thing here. I need a little bit more blue. It's kind of absorbing into my paper here. There we go. So you can keep layering these in this way. So as we can see, whether we start with the red or the blue, we're going to get a slightly different color coming out on top. What if we were to take, I don't know, just some of this purple, make a little bit of a purple mix, and then let's just add it over here. So we can start getting some really very rich colors just by glazing. And you'll notice also, the more layers that we put, the darker the color gets. So this is something that I always think about when I'm doing a grisaille method, because whatever I put down is going to darken when I'm putting other colors over top. So I often try to aim at a slightly lighter grisaille than what I want my finished piece to be, just so that it just compensates for that darkening through glazing when I put the colors on top, because I don't want to end up with an overall dark painting. And that's one of the dangers of grisaille. So when it comes to grisaille, the reason why I like to teach this as a base format for all artists is that it allows you to handle your light and dark composition and basically the overall drawing of your subject matter in advance. So we're removing the complexities of color out of the equation of value, because some colors can be the same value, but because of their saturation, they can appear darker than they actually are. Red is a very good example of this. Red almost always looks dark in value, when in fact it's just highly saturated. So it could be light in value, but appear darker. So this is one of the sort of complications that artists have to deal with color and value. And you get used to it over time. but it's just something to be aware of. So just before I head into that, I want to show you what happens with these colors if I add white, and then I'm going to circle back to going over grisaille with these colors. So I'm actually just gonna, I'll just use some of my cheap stuff for now. It doesn't really matter. It's just workbook stuff. I would say though, with colors, it's better to get the professional brands. I've noticed on some of the cheaper ones, they don't put enough pigment in. So if you're trying to learn color mixing, you're gonna end up with results that are maybe not accurate to real world, and then you might be confused later when you actually head over to proper pigment load and quality of pigment. So I'm just going to take some of this red, and I just want to show you. So here we've got a light purple. If I were to take this red and blue and mix it, I'm going to end up with a fairly dark purple. If we want it more blue, we just add a bit more blue. I'll sort of try to aim for a similar to something like this. Now, if I were to add white to this to try to bring the value up, and you'll see this is what I mean when I say it desaturates the color. Now we have something that looks sort of flat and gray. So even if I'm sort of aiming for a similar type purple, it doesn't have the same luminosity as the glazed colors. So here we're getting more rich mixing vibrant colors, and here we have something that is tending more toward a tint or a tone, whereas it sort of grays it out. That said, I'll let this dry a little bit. And actually, just a minute, this is where we're gonna get back sort of into the grisaille thing. I'm just gonna add a little bit more white so you can kind of see a gradient here. So this is a bit more red than the other one. So if, let's say I wanted to tint it back to blue, I'm gonna grab my, oh, over here. Grab my blue pigment and a bunch of my gel medium. I gotta wait. Give that a second to dry. It has to be fully dry or it's gonna mix. And I don't want that because there's white in there. Just blowing on it a little bit. Okay, so now if I put this color over my gradient, now I've brought the luminosity back up and we can still see that transition from dark to light. So you can keep layering this way. Sometimes when I do my paintings, it might take me one layer to be happy. Sometimes it takes me several. So we've got the gradient happening underneath from dark to light, but we've brought back that luminosity and that light traveling through the layers with the glazing. So that's pretty awesome. Something happens when I try to paint foliage. So let's just say I mix a green. Let's say we're gonna do some leaves. I'll use a little, so this is kind of like a little real world application. So let's say I've got some, darker foliage here. This is maybe not the best brush, just a minute. Grab this one. I just want to do some, and then maybe some of them are darker, so I've let some more blue come through. So I've got sort of like a bush here. Grab some more yellow because usually they're brighter. So now what we've got here, because this is transparent pigment and it's on a white background, I have something that looks quite luminous, but let's say this is all still too dark and I want to keep it green, but bring up the value to look like there's even more highlights. If I take my white and I mix yellow, and let's say even a bit of green just to get a bright light green color, but I put this over top to try to give those highlights, this doesn't really work. As you can see, they actually push backwards. They don't pop forwards like I would expect with highlights. They're kind of just white and deadened. So I'm gonna let that dry, and then I will go over with a glaze of yellow, and that will bring the vibrancy back. And also, let's say this is dry now, so I could go back in, and this is where I love my Payne's Gray. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit of Payne's Gray because it's a very dark color. It doesn't overpower anything. It's transparent, and I use it instead of black for my shadows, especially on outdoor. And it works so well with skin and everything. It's just one of those magical colors. So I'm just gonna take some Payne's Gray, and let's say this is the underneath part of the bush. And again, it's just thin little layers. But as you can see, this sort of gives me some shadows in there, and it mixes super nicely. We have all the colors coming through each other. We've got the white of the paper. This dry. Okay, so while this dries, because I don't like to wait, we're gonna mix some black and white to make some gradients. And then we will go back over that with yellow. So I've already got some white out. I'm gonna take my, that's Payne's Gray. I'm going to take my black, which I set beside me, and I have lost somehow. Here it is. I'll take that Mars black. All right. These are handy. I will give you this to print out. It's just a grayscale. So when I'm looking, for example, at my reference material, which is a black and white printout that I took of our reference, and I'm also sending you, it helps me to understand the values that I'm looking at, which just helps me later for mixing. Acrylic paint does darken when it dries, so I tend to try to mix a little bit lighter, generally speaking, again, because I don't want to create dark overall paintings. So yeah, usually, let's say I just want to make a bit of a gradient. So you can either start with white or black and add in. So I'll sort of make like a 50% here, sort of like half and half. Add a bit more white. And a bit more white. And a bit more white. Sometimes there's just paint in your brush. Just kind of mixing them as we go this way. Add a bit more black to it. And then sort of let it mix in through here. So this isn't super precise right now, it's just for the exercise. I just want to get a bit of a gradient to work with. All right. And I will let that dry. This is still a bit wet to the touch, so I'm just gonna wait. Sometimes you can just sort of dab it if it's too thick. I wouldn't suggest this necessarily on an actual painting, just be patient, but because it's just a demo, we can do that. The other thing that I want to do, let's say, is create just a little bit of a ground. So A tinted ground is when you take your canvas and instead of painting on pure white, you're painting on a color. So you might decide that your entire painting or your entire background is going to have a nice warm glow. So basically what happens is anything, any spaces between your paint will have this nice warm color. It kind of unifies the paint. So that would be, let's say, if we do an example where we're just doing our color that is transparent over white and we get this really luminous color. Otherwise, the other thing that we can do is mix basically our color into gesso. So we can mix sort of a similar value, but this is more opaque and the white is now mixed in to our color. This actually does react differently. It seems really funny that it would because it's essentially the same color, but it does react funny later. All right, see, that's pretty dry. So I'm just gonna go and add, let's say we wanted to make highlights on those little leaves here. Oops. And I think it's a good idea to just sort of experiment with all of the colors that you have in this way, just to sort of get to know your palette and how they interact with each other and just kind of practice your sort of color mixing fundamentals using these techniques, whereas you're mixing your colors together and then mixing them by glazing just to see the different possibilities. So I'm going to take my yellow here and water it down a little bit. And if I just go over top of this, we've shifted those whites now to yellow, but they're a luminous yellow that allows the light to pass through and bounce off the white marks that we made. So those white marks no longer look bright and like they're lacking light. They look quite luminous. And then we could take maybe some of this green and let's say this one, we just want to push it back a little bit. Maybe this one, maybe this one a little bit. And that one. So now we can still see these little white highlights, but they're pushed back more from the yellow ones. So essentially glazing is done this way. Just a little bit more. Say we want even brighter little highlights by adding pure white over some of this. We'll put some down here in the dark too, just so we can see it better in contrast. And okay, so let's say in a real world scenario, we've got some little bits of grass. Actually, I'm gonna use a thinner brush for this, just so I can get, this is called a detailer brush, or a rigger. I love these for doing details, obviously. So I'm just gonna take some white paint and a little bit of water, and I'm just gonna sketch out some grass. And I'm gonna do the same over here. Some highlights. So you can actually draw when you're doing grisaille, you can actually draw with white. I will also, because as we know, grass is green, I'm going to take some blue and some yellow. The nice thing about these fluid colors is that they are quite pigmented. So if I want to warm this up a bit, I can just take some of this color that was in the background and I can get myself a nice warm green color. gonna sort of layer some of this over here. Maybe some Payne's gray and blue into the bottom. That's a bit dark, so I'm just gonna remove some of that paint with water. And let this sort of mix in here. Some grass going, some shadow in the bottom. And again, I'm gonna mix some green, make it a little bit warmer. So you can work with this light to dark, dark to light, light to dark, dark to light. I do that all the time with this technique. I move in every direction. Grab some more of this. And then we had a little bit of a shadow color on the bottom. Just some Payne's gray. You can see the Payne's gray is quite blue. This fluid acrylic really works a lot like watercolor. It's quite nice. Oh, I'm just gonna check this. It's still wet. All right. So let's say we wanted to make this a gradient of, I don't know, because we're painting a honey jar, maybe a golden yellow. So we've got our gradient. Let's take a color that's a little bit like honey. So I've got the nickel azul gold, which is just an incredibly beautiful color. I'm just gonna pull it out on here so you can see it. So that's what it looks like. It's actually kind of the color of honey. A bit of green in my brush, so I'm gonna remove that. So let's say we take this just straight off of the palette. Look at that. So this is how we essentially tint our gradient to the color that we need. And then let's say for this grass, it's dry. I'm gonna go and add some of this color with a bit of my yellow just to make it warm, but still brighter a little bit. And then I'm just gonna come over my grass here. Oh, that was still a little bit wet, so that pulled. Take some of this. And I can glaze over that. Might make it a little bit warmer because it does tint a bit green, as I mentioned, when we're going over any kind of black. Yeah, those are still wet. And then let's say I do want some more highlights up here though. So now I can go in, even if this isn't completely dry, I could go in with some more white or even some of this yellow. There's nothing stopping you from making a warmer white to do sort of a veil and to bring this up again in saturation. Or sorry, in value, not saturation. This will actually desaturate the color. Here, I'm gonna just put like a little bit of a line across here so you can see it. And as the paint dries and I lay it over again, you'll see it goes brighter. I will wait for that to dry. So now let's say I wanted to add some more grass in here that's a bit brighter. I can come in with my sort of warm yellow white. And I can pull in some more little grass pieces here. So this is actually how I tackle the fur when I'm doing pet portraits. I do back and forth between opaque colors, opaque white, or basically opaque colors that are mixed from my palette. And then I go back in later with pure transparent pigment. Some sort of little grass. I'm not doing my best here to make it look realistic. It's just to give you the idea of how all of this kind of works together in layers together. And let's take, no, it's pretty dry. It's not going to mix too much. So again, here, because I want these to be nice bright highlights, like they're being hit by the sun, I'm going to take my yellow and just go straight over top. And if I wanted to warm this color, I could then just go in and add like a red glaze. And then I get all those interesting color shifts and variations. Let's wait for this stuff to dry, and then I'll just do another coat just so you can kind of see what's happening and how everything interacts together. This is not yet dry, but I can still go in and let them sort of mix and mingle. So as you can see on the tinted ground, the color underneath had an influence over the color coming back at you. So it warmed up my greens by default. Any little spaces between the colors will have this warmth coming through. So it tends to sort of unify the look of an entire painting. So with the mediums, as you see, you kind of retain some brush strokes. If you're going straight onto your surface without adding mediums, you get a smoother finish. So that's something that I do like to think about when I'm painting. If I want the smoother finish, I will go directly with just a bit of water or with a bit of my slow dry mixed with water, just because I know that they will sort of self-level and I will get a very even finish like this, for example, whereas this, we notice, has more texture, and that's when we added the gel medium in. The more medium you add, the more texture you're gonna get. Just gonna add a bit of this. This is pretty pure pigment green, and I'm just gonna go straight over top, and as you can see, as it goes over the dark bits, they retain the darkness. But as we go over the light, those look like highlights. But then the whole thing in general sort of comes closer to the same color. So it's like I'm tinting my highlights and my shadows with the same green. But because we have a variety of colors happening through here, we get something that's incredibly rich, and there's a lot of variation and sort of drama with the colors instead of just mixing a green and painting your grass all the same green, for example. It's a really nice way to add some very complex color mixing without trying too hard. So let's say that we want this to be more of the golden yellow or golden honey part. I'm just gonna add a little bit of the nickel azo gold maybe. It's a little bit more yellow, but it's a warmer yellow than this. It's a bit more warmer than the, however you say that, very long word. So now we're preserving our value structure, but we're tinting it. We're tinting it basically to the color that we want. And if I want the tail end here to be a little bit more orange, for example, because maybe it turns more orange into the shadows where it's a little bit more amber, I can just come across here and it's going to make this more amber orange color. So that's essentially how I handle my colors and my pigments and my mixing when I'm dealing with glazing and gradients and things. So this is the grisaille. We've basically done a grisaille method here. So starting on black and white to control our values, so from dark to light value. And then we've gone over that with pure color and sometimes a bit of white, which makes an opaque impure color to bring the values back up and play again within the gradient. And also basically to tint the gradient now from just a straight black and white to maybe like a warm white. And then we go back over to control the colors and the saturation again. So that's it for your introduction on sort of the basics of the materials and how I think about layering and mixing my colors when I do glazing. Let me know if you have any questions and I will be very happy to answer those. And yeah, so what we can do for next week is to transfer our drawing onto, so actually I'm gonna want us to start on a gray background. So you wanna mix up basically with your black and white, sort of a mid-tone gray, not too dark, not too light, sort of 50%. So mix the same amount of black and white together. And then take some carbon paper and your, I've got the background on, so your drawing and your carbon paper. And I would suggest actually using a red pencil crayon if you have one to trace over just so you can see where you've drawn already. So you want to basically just put the dark side of your carbon paper facing, or I'll switch the camera so you can see. All right, so for next class, we're going to transfer our drawing. So we've got the black and white here, and you'll need some carbon paper. And you also want to sort of tint your ground, so whatever ground you're using, as a sort of 50% gray. So let's say I'm going to use this canvas paper. I want to take a fairly large brush. It's best to use a flat brush. Got some color in here, but it's not that big of a deal. It's warm and it's and I will just take some white. Oops, some white paint. And I want quite a bit because I need to make enough to cover. Something else that we can do is we can tape off the edges, or just if you want to not be that precise, you can just freehand it because it is just an exercise. But if you want it to look more pro, I usually just get some painter's tape and tape off my edge. I want to make a 50% sort of gray. This is just so that I can push my lights and shadows at the same time. It's a bit like working on a tinted ground. If you find that your paint isn't moving well enough, feel free to add a little bit of water. You don't want more than 25%, as it can sort of ruin the bonds between the paint molecules. So it reduces their ability to adhere together, which is never good. But you can add some paint or some water as a vehicle. Again, I'm just gonna add a bit of water. And I want to kind of get this nice and smooth. I don't want a lot of ridges or brush strokes in here already, because that will always read through my painting. I like to use texture in a meaningful way where I want there to be a ridge. For example, if there is, I don't know, some ripples on some water, maybe I want the rest of the water to be flat, but in the spot where the air is or the wind is going over the water and causing the ripples, I might want those ripples to be relieved because they will help to throw light on that broken surface. So I don't want there to be an edge on something in the painting that should be smooth, like in this case, glass. So we're just gonna tint our canvas to a gray. Oops. We're gonna go over this again, so it doesn't matter if it's fully exact. I just want a color down. You can always mix up more paint to begin with. I tend to always underestimate the amount that I'm going to need, but it's better, I think, in the end to overestimate. I just hate wasting paint, so that's what happens with me. Take a little bit more black here. Oops. There we go. That'll come on better. This also kind of creates a nice plastic surface, so your paint won't absorb too quickly. When you're working on paper directly, or even on canvas directly without a coat of, let's say, acrylic leveling gel or just other paint on it, it tends to be quite absorbent. All right, so you just want to make sure that essentially your gray space is going to be big enough to fit your drawing. We can transfer that with our carbon paper and we'll be ready to go for next week as our drawing will be done and we can get to the grisaille. So I just wanted to say thanks for joining me for this first class. Again, reach out if you have any questions and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye.